White billionaire family mocked the black woman at party, then she canceled their $10B deal. The first insult cut through the chatter like broken glass. You don't belong here. Heads turned, champagne flutes froze midair. Margaret Witmore stood at the center of the marble foyer, her silver hair perfectly set, her diamond necklace catching the light. She didn't shout, she projected, every syllable carrying authority, every word dripping with disdain. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits stopped mid-conversation, their attention drawn like moths to a flame. Across from her, a woman in an evening gown stood motionless. A crimson stain bled down the silk. An entire glass of wine had exploded against her torso moments earlier. The droplets slid down the fabric and splashed onto the white marble floor, each one loud in the sudden quiet. Her hair, once immaculate, now clung to her cheek, and yet her posture remained upright. Eyes locked on Margaret. Phones were already out. Not discreetly, boldly. Guests framed the moment as if it were part of the evening's entertainment. Laughter bubbled from one corner. Someone whispered something to a friend and pointed, that small, cruel smile that says, "Watch this." Margaret took a step forward, her heels clicking in perfect rhythm with her voice. "I said, you don't belong here, and you never will." The woman didn't move, didn't blink. She simply adjusted her grip on the phone in her hand. Security guards, two of them, hovered a few paces away, clearly waiting for the order to remove her. One looked almost eager. The other stared at the floor. A group of young men in tuxedos laughed outright. One of them, glassy-eyed from too much champagne, lifted his glass toward her like a toast. "Careful with the silverware," he slurred. "Wouldn't want to lose the good forks." His friends howled. By the window, two women in gowns leaned toward each other. "Do you know who she is?" one whispered. "No idea," the other replied, smirking. "But I know who she isn't." Margaret tilted her head, savoring the spectacle. "Security," she called, without looking away. "Please escort this guest out before she damages anything valuable." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd. The security guards moved in. That's when the woman finally stepped forward. The light caught her eyes, and in them was something sharp enough to stop both men mid-step. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't plead. She just held her phone slightly higher, and for a split second, the room seemed to hesitate. Because in that look, there was no shame, no defeat, only the quiet promise of consequences. If you're watching this and believe respect should never be optional, take a second to like this video. Then drop a comment telling us the country you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're joining us, and of course, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Back in the foyer, the silence was growing heavier by the second. Even those who had been laughing were now watching more intently, unsure why the air felt different. Margaret broke the pause with another swipe of her tongue. "You're nothing," she said, louder this time, her eyes glittering as if the words themselves were jewels. "Do you understand? Nothing." The woman straightened her shoulders, ignoring the wine soaking into her gown. A small circle of guests had formed, their expressions ranging from open mockery to thinly veiled fascination. She took one slow glance around the room. The chandeliers, the tables laid with rare vintages, the faces of people who believed they could erase her with a sentence. And then her gaze settled back on the Witmores. One of the younger women in the family, all diamonds and satin, let out a giggle. She's probably looking for the kitchen. Laughter again. Louder this time. Phones moved closer. The woman's grip on her phone tightened. She lifted it just slightly, not enough to record, but enough to make everyone wonder if she already had. Margaret noticed. For a flicker of a second, her smile faltered. Then she recovered, gesturing to the guards again. Still, the woman didn't move. She didn't back down. And the longer she stood there, the more the laughter began to sound nervous. A guest near the back muttered to his wife, "What is she waiting for?" The answer came in the smallest of gestures. The woman tapped her phone screen once and brought it to her ear. The guards froze. Margaret narrowed her eyes. She turned slightly away from them, her voice low but clear enough to carry. "Yes, it's me. End it." No one knew what those two words meant. Not yet. But by the time dessert trays circled the room, the Witmores would. They had just mocked the woman who could erase $10 billion from their future before the night was over. And she had every intention of doing exactly that. For most in that room, the woman in the ruined gown was an unknown face, just another outsider to be dismissed. But outside those walls, her name commanded boardrooms on every continent. She had been born in a 2-bedroom apartment above a small grocery store in Newark, New Jersey. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse, her father fixed cars in a garage that barely kept the lights on. Money was tight, but their home pulsed with something far more valuable: dignity. And the anchor of that dignity was her grandmother, a woman whose calloused hands had raised 3 generations without ever once letting poverty rob her of pride. Her grandmother's lessons were relentless and simple. Never let anyone tell you where you belong. Never forget that respect is earned by how you treat people, not by what you own. Those words were planted deep long before Simone had a dollar to her name. School wasn't a place she merely attended. It was where she fought to prove she deserved a seat at the table. Straight A's weren't a goal. They were a requirement she set for herself. Scholarships opened doors. Internships, often in offices where she was the only black woman in the building, hardened her resolve. She endured the condescending tones, the casual dismissals, the way some colleagues looked past her as though she were invisible. She didn't just survive it, she made a silent vow to own the very floors she was told she'd never walk. That vow became the seed of Richardson Global Industries. It started with a single real estate deal, a rundown block in a neglected neighborhood that no major developer wanted to touch. She saw potential, bought it, rebuilt it, and proved every skeptic wrong. Profits rolled in, but she didn't stop. Over the next decade, she expanded into commercial spaces, tech manufacturing plants, and logistics hubs. She didn't chase trends, she built infrastructure. By year 15, Richardson Global Industries wasn't just a company. It was an empire spanning real estate, technology, manufacturing, and renewable energy. Her portfolio held skyscrapers in Manhattan, industrial parks in Texas, shipping terminals in Singapore. She had forged partnerships with Fortune 500 companies, employed over 100,000 people worldwide, and negotiated deals with heads of state. Her net worth climbed past $57 billion, but it wasn't the money that defined her. It was the way she walked into any room, knowing she belonged. Not because someone invited her, but because she had earned it. Yet, for all her power, she never distanced herself from the people who reminded her where she started. Her grandmother's framed photograph sat on the desk in every office she owned. She funded scholarships for students from overlooked neighborhoods. She personally mentored young entrepreneurs, especially women of color, teaching them not just business strategy, but the unshakable posture of self-respect. And still, she knew wealth couldn't buy immunity from prejudice. She had sat through meetings where her ideas were ignored until repeated by a white male colleague. She had been assumed to be the assistant instead of the CEO. And now here she was, in a room filled with people whose fortunes were a fraction of hers, yet who believed their skin color alone made them superior. The irony was almost unbearable, because the very family orchestrating her humiliation that night, the Witmores, needed her more than they had ever needed anyone. Charles Witmore's real estate empire was crumbling under debt. Their lavish lifestyle teetered on the edge of foreclosure. The merger with Richardson Global Industries was their salvation. Months of negotiations had been conducted through legal teams and intermediaries. Charles had never met her in person, never even seen her photograph. In his mind, the person holding the pen over that deal was likely a man who looked and thought like him. That ignorance was about to cost them everything. The party they were hosting wasn't just a charity gala. It was meant to be the announcement of their partnership. The press was waiting for the official statement. Investors were poised to celebrate the news. The Witmores' future, their reputation, their wealth, their ability to remain in New York's elite social circles hung entirely on her willingness to sign that contract. And yet, instead of welcoming her, instead of showing even the bare minimum of respect, they had stripped her of dignity in front of an audience. She stood there, the weight of her grandmother's lessons in her chest, the sting of every past slight sharpened into a single, unshakable truth. No amount of money was worth giving power to people who saw her as less than human. This night was supposed to cement a partnership, until the Witmores destroyed their own future. On the surface, the Witmore name carried weight. Their family had been etched into New York society columns for generations. Charity galas, polo tournaments, exclusive Hamptons estates. Old money elegance was their brand, and they wore it like a crown. But under that polished exterior, cracks had spread so deep that the only thing holding it together was the illusion. Charles Witmore had inherited an empire built on prime Manhattan real estate. Towers, luxury hotels, landmark office buildings. But the world he inherited wasn't the one his father had thrived in. The market had shifted. Corporate tenants fled to cheaper cities, luxury buyers turned to newer developments, and maintenance costs bled millions from the portfolio every quarter. Charles wasn't a visionary. He was a caretaker who had been handed more than he could manage. For years, he propped up failing properties with loans that came due faster than he could refinance. He'd sell off one building to pay debt on another, each deal shrinking the empire a little more. Behind closed doors, bankers whispered that Witmore Industries was circling the drain. The Richardson Global merger wasn't just a smart move, it was survival. $10 billion in cash and asset integration could erase his debt, stabilize his holdings, and make him look like a savior instead of a man drowning in his inheritance. Without it, the Witmore fortune would dissolve, and the family would be stripped of the very thing they prized most: status. Margaret Witmore lived for that status. To her, social dominance wasn't a byproduct of wealth. It was the currency that mattered most. She curated every guest list, every fundraiser, every photo that would appear in the society pages. In her mind, worth wasn't measured in business achievements or philanthropy, but in who had to ask for your approval before they could walk through your door. Her cruelty wasn't random, it was targeted. Margaret had a radar for vulnerability, a way of zeroing in on those she thought could be made to feel small. She believed in hierarchy, one where she was always at the top, and skin color, accent, and heritage were part of her mental ledger. She didn't hide it, she flaunted it. That's why when she saw Simone in that gown, she didn't think guest. She thought outsider. Brandon Witmore was the embodiment of everything people despise about entitled wealth. 28 years old, he had been given businesses to run, apartments to live in, and endless allowances to spend. Every opportunity ended in failure, not because he lacked resources, but because he had no interest in work that didn't involve nightlife or exclusive vacations. He surrounded himself with equally spoiled friends, each one competing in cruelty disguised as wit. For Brandon, degrading others was a sport, and the gala provided the perfect arena. Sophia Witmore had mastered a different kind of weapon. At 26, she was polished, charming, and strikingly beautiful. The kind of beauty that disarmed strangers before the sting of her words landed. She had learned from Margaret that humiliation could be wrapped in a smile, and she wielded it with precision. Sophia didn't shout. She whispered just loud enough for the right ears to hear. Her insults dressed as observations. In rooms like the gala, she was both the instigator and the amplifier, ensuring any ridicule took root and spread. Together, they were a family bound less by love and more by a shared belief that the world existed to serve them. They maintained their public image with lavish events and strategic alliances, masking the truth from guests and even from themselves. Their empire was collapsing. That's why the Richardson Global deal was more than a business transaction. It was their lifeline, their only chance to keep wearing the crown they believed was theirs by birthright. The papers were ready. The announcement was planned. The cameras were primed to capture the handshake that would declare to the world that Witmore Industries was back in control. But none of their meticulous planning, none of their posing, none of their charm accounted for one glaring oversight. Charles Witmore had never met Simone in person, never seen her in a meeting, never even glanced at her photograph. In his mind, the CEO he was depending on looked like him, someone older, male, and white. That blind assumption was about to cost him everything, but Charles had never even seen Simone's face, and that would be his downfall. The black sedan glided to a stop in front of the towering glass entrance. Its polished surface reflected the warm glow spilling from the lobby, where waiters in white gloves carried silver trays and guests in sequined gowns drifted toward the elevators. The doorman opened the car door and heels touched down on the sidewalk. Deliberate, unhurried steps. She wasn't just attending this gala. She owned the company that owned the building it was being held in. Every marble tile in that lobby, every pane of glass on the 50 stories above, they were part of her portfolio. The valet didn't know that. He strode toward her with the impatient gait of someone certain he knew the boundaries of the world. And hers. "Service entrance is around back," he said, tilting his head toward a narrow alley. No greeting, no question, just a flat directive, as if it were obvious she couldn't possibly belong at the front. "I'm here for the gala," she replied evenly. He gave her a quick up-and-down look. "Yeah, I'm sure you are," he said, voice thick with disbelief. Then, almost reluctantly, he waved her toward the main doors. Inside, the security podium stood like a checkpoint. A man in a black suit, badge on his lapel, scanned invitations and waved guests through without so much as a pause. His name tag read Jake. She waited as a woman in a fur wrap flashed a folded envelope and sailed past. A man in a tuxedo strolled up mid-phone call. Jake barely looked at the card in his hand before smiling him inside. When it was her turn, the smile vanished. Jake took her thick, embossed invitation and held it as if it were counterfeit money. He glanced at the list on the podium, then back at the invitation, then at her face. "I don't see a Richardson here," he announced, loud enough for the couple behind her to hear. "It's there," she said, calm but firm. "I'm expected." He checked the list again, dragging his finger down the page like the name might magically appear if he stared long enough. "Nope," he said finally, shaking his head. Meanwhile, another couple approached. He greeted them warmly, barely glancing at their invitation before ushering them through. She pointed to her name printed clearly on the invitation in his hand. "It matches the list you have." Jake shrugged. "These can be faked. People print them to look all official." His tone was patronizing, like a teacher explaining something to a child who wouldn't understand. "I'm going to need ID." She handed over her driver's license. A legitimate New York State card, photo taken just months ago. He studied it with exaggerated scrutiny, tilting it under the light, running his fingers over it as though expecting it to dissolve. "This doesn't look real," he said finally, and nearby guests pretended not to listen while leaning just close enough to hear. "It's real," she replied, her patience thinning. "I'll have to verify with management," Jake said. "You'll need to wait outside." He stepped away, taking both her invitation and ID. She waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Through the glass, she could see him chatting with another guard, laughing, making no calls. Guests kept streaming in, some showing nothing more than a wave of paper, others recognized by face alone, all of them white. All of them welcomed. The air bit at her skin, the thin fabric of her evening gown offering no protection. Her feet ached in heels meant for ballrooms, not sidewalks. The minutes turned into hours. Twice Jake returned to tell her they were still checking, the words smooth but empty. At one point, a group of young men, tipsy and loud, stumbled toward the door. Jake grinned at them, clapping one on the back before ushering them inside without even a glance at their credentials. Moments later, an older woman without an invitation at all explained she'd misplaced it. Jake waved her in with a smile. She remained outside, waiting, watching. 2 hours after she had arrived, Jake finally reappeared with her ID and invitation in hand. "You can go in now," he said without apology. Her legs were stiff, her hair slightly windblown, her excitement about the evening drained away. She stepped past him into the warmth of the marble foyer, her heels clicking on the floor she technically owned. She didn't know it yet, but the humiliation she had endured outside was just the opening act. By the time she got inside, the real attack began. The foyer was warm, but the air was thick with the kind of silence that turns heads. She had barely taken 3 steps in when the first blow landed, not physical, but sharp enough to sting. Oh my God. How did the cleaning lady get past security? Margaret Witmore's voice was pitched high enough to slice through the room. She stood across the marble floor, pearls resting against her collarbone, lips curved in a smile that wasn't friendly. Every syllable was calculated to carry, to invite an audience. The effect was immediate. Conversations died. Champagne flutes lowered. Guests turned to watch, curiosity morphing into amusement as they realized what was happening. Charles Witmore, in his tailored tuxedo, paused mid-story with a group of investors. His gaze found her and tightened into a look of irritation, as if her very presence was an inconvenience. "This is a private event, not a job fair," he called out, voice booming. "Security!" Laughter rippled through a small group by the bar. Among them, Brandon Witmore, already glassy-eyed from too much champagne, raised his glass toward her like a mock toast. "Did someone order maid service?" he shouted. "Because I think our bathrooms could use some attention." The group around him roared. Someone slapped him on the back, nearly spilling his drink. Near the photographer's corner, Sophia Witmore tilted her head just enough to catch the light on her diamond earrings. "She's probably looking for the broom closet," she said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. The words floated across the room like perfume, sickly sweet and laced with poison. More laughter, the kind that feeds on itself. A semicircle began to form, guests subtly shifting to see her better, their expressions somewhere between entertained and disdainful. Phones appeared again, discreet to some, brazen to others. No one intervened. She started to speak, the beginnings of an introduction forming in her throat, but Margaret closed the distance, heels clicking against marble like punctuation marks. "Sweetheart," Margaret said, each word slow and deliberate, "you're nothing. Do you understand me? Nothing. This isn't your world, and it never will be." Her smile widened as if savoring the taste of her own cruelty. "You're wretched, pathetic, and you don't deserve to breathe the same air as decent people like us." Charles gave an approving nod from across the room, hands clasped behind his back like a man observing order being restored. In the corner, two women whispered behind manicured hands. "Look at her pretending she belongs here," one said. "The audacity," the other replied with a smirk. When she moved toward the bar, intent on nothing more than a glass of water, the bartender glanced nervously toward Margaret. A quick shake of Margaret's head was all it took. "No drinks for the help," Margaret announced, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "She doesn't deserve even water from our glasses." Brandon doubled over laughing, steadying himself against the bar. "If you want to feel useful tonight," he slurred, "why don't you go help the real staff serve real people? At least then, you'd be doing something you're actually qualified for." Sophia clapped her hands together in mock delight. Yes, finally something she might be good at. The circle around her tightened. Guests passed by, tossing small jabs as if it were part of the evening's entertainment. "She's brave, I'll give her that, walking in here like she belongs. Maybe she's auditioning for something. Security's slipping if this is what gets through." Her feet ached from hours of waiting outside, but now there was nowhere to sit. When she tried to approach a cluster of empty chairs near the back, Margaret stepped into her path. "Those are for guests," she said, gaze sweeping over her as though inspecting a spill on the floor. "Not for whatever you are." So she stood, and the mocking continued, not in a wave, but in steady, deliberate hits. A man in a navy suit passed by, looked her up and down, and muttered, "Wrong address." A woman in sequins shook her head as if disappointed, not in Margaret's behavior, but in her existence. The live band played on, a jazzy number that seemed to underscore the surreal cruelty of it all. Waiters moved between guests with trays of champagne, careful not to drift too close to where she stood, as if proximity might invite reprimand. For over an hour she was kept in that corner. Not just ignored, weaponized as the night's spectacle. Every smirk, every whispered comment, every phone camera aimed her way was another reminder. This wasn't about an accidental slight. It was about removal. It was about telling her she had no place in the room. Not now, not ever. Simone realized she wasn't just being insulted, she was being erased. Standing in that corner, the noise of the gala faded into a dull hum she no longer heard. Her mind wasn't on the music or the clinking glasses. It was on the contract waiting in her hotel suite just blocks away. For months, her legal team and the Witmores had been locked in negotiations. There had been conference calls that stretched into the night, drafts revised line by line, and endless discussions about asset valuations, debt restructuring, and the delicate balance of merging two empires. She had been patient, deliberate, knowing this deal could either salvage their name or bury it entirely. $10 billion. That was the figure both sides had agreed to. a sum that would pour oxygen into Witmore Industries, pay off their crippling debts, and give them room to rebuild. It would also grant Richardson Global Industries prime Manhattan properties that could be turned into profitable centers within 2 years. On paper, it was a win for both. But in reality, the scales had always tipped in her favor. She had the cash, she had the stronger company, and most importantly, she had options. Charles Witmore didn't. The irony cut sharper than anything Margaret had said to her tonight. They needed her more than she had ever needed them. Without that money, they were finished. Their lenders would start circling, their investors would abandon ship, and their reputation among the elite they courted so desperately would crumble overnight. And yet here they were, sneering at her, as though her value was something they could decide. She thought of her grandmother's voice. Steady, unshakable. The same voice that had carried her through moments when the world tried to reduce her to nothing. Respect is worth more than any check. It was a lesson she had carried from childhood into every boardroom. Deals could be postponed, rewritten, or scrapped entirely. Money could be made again. But dignity, once surrendered, didn't return. Her eyes swept the room. The glittering gowns, the self-satisfied smiles, the clinking of glasses filled with champagne she had paid for without them even knowing. They were celebrating a future they believed was already secured. Only she knew how fragile that future really was. The decision was already forming, clear and cold. She didn't have to raise her voice, didn't have to make a scene. All it would take was a single call to her lawyers. The contracts wouldn't be signed. The press statement prepared for tomorrow would never be released. The Witmores would wake up to a very different reality. One where the woman they had mocked in front of their friends had quietly pulled the floor out from under them. A murmur of laughter from across the room caught her attention. Brandon was still holding court with his friends, retelling his maid service joke like it was the highlight of the evening. Margaret was beside him, nodding to guests who passed as if she had performed some act of noble gatekeeping by keeping Simone in her place. Sophia floated between tables, dropping subtle whispers that made people glance her way and smirk. It would be so easy to let them keep going, to let them revel in their ignorance for just a little longer. One call could burn their empire to the ground. She didn't storm out, she didn't slam a glass on the floor or demand an apology. Outwardly, she was still. Inside, her thoughts moved like sharpened blades. She began making a list in her mind, not of insults thrown her way, but of pressure points. Charles's debt structure, Margaret's dependence on elite event invitations, Brandon's reliance on the family allowance to fund his indulgences, Sophia's fragile social alliances that turned on a whisper. Every name, every asset, every weakness cataloged itself. She had dismantled bigger opponents than this family without breaking a sweat, and this time she had something more potent than financial leverage. She had a reason. From where she stood, she could see the stage at the far end of the room. A banner hung above it with the name of the charity they were claiming to support, an organization supposedly dedicated to promoting inclusion and diversity in business leadership. The irony stung. Guests mingled beneath that banner while laughing at the only black woman in the room, as if she were part of the evening's decor. She watched as Margaret swept toward a new arrival, air kissing both cheeks and speaking about the importance of representation, into a cluster of reporters' microphones. The hypocrisy was a performance so brazen it would have been comical if it weren't so insulting. From the corner of her eye, she caught Brandon signaling for another drink, leaning in to tell the bartender that she, still standing alone, should make herself useful and pass these around. The bartender laughed nervously, unsure whether to play along or shrink back. The air in the room buzzed with conversation, but the sound was different now. She realized more people were looking her way than before, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled contempt. It didn't matter. Their opinions had no weight in the world she operated in. Her phone vibrated once in her hand, a message. She glanced down. CFO, media embargo lifts tomorrow, ready to announce? The statement had been prepared for weeks. Tomorrow morning, headlines across financial news outlets were supposed to read about the historic Richardson-Witmore merger, hailed as a triumph of cross-industry cooperation. She looked up, taking in the glittering chandeliers, the guests clinking glasses in anticipation of a future that wouldn't exist. Brandon's laugh carried across the room again. Sophia whispered into a woman's ear, both of them glancing over in her direction with smirks that said they thought they were invisible. Simone's thumb hovered over the screen. Her team was waiting for a simple confirmation. One word and the wheels of the deal would spin forward as planned. She thought of her grandmother's voice again. Respect is worth more than any check. Her gaze moved to the banner above the stage, then back to Margaret, who was posing for another photograph, her face arranged in an expression of faux benevolence. The hypocrisy wasn't just an insult to her personally. It was an insult to every person excluded by rooms like this while being told from a podium that they were welcome. She felt the decision crystallize. Her reply to her CFO was short, "Not anymore." The balcony doors were half hidden behind a cluster of tall potted plants, almost as if they were meant to discourage guests from wandering outside. Simone slipped through them quietly, the laughter and music dulling to a distant hum behind her. Cool air brushed against her skin, carrying the faint hum of traffic far below. From here, the city stretched endlessly, skyscrapers glowing in the night, windows flickering with other people's lives. Somewhere out there, millions of people were fighting to be seen, to be heard. And here she was, standing above them, in a place where her worth had been reduced to the color of her skin. She drew her phone from her clutch, scrolling to the number she knew by memory. Her lead counsel answered on the second ring. "Good evening, Miss Richardson," he began, his voice formal but warm. "I assume you're still at the Witmore event?" "I am," she said, steady as steel, "and I need you to listen very carefully." There was a pause. "Of course. The merger. Cancel it. Effective immediately." Silence stretched for half a beat. "Cancel?" "Yes," she said, each syllable deliberate. "Contact their legal team tonight. Inform them that Richardson Global Industries will not be moving forward with any partnership, acquisition, or merger involving Witmore Industries. Draft a public statement citing ethical incompatibility as the reason." Her counsel hesitated. "Ms. Richardson, this is unprecedented. The agreements are ready for signature." "The media announcement is—" "I'm aware of the schedule," she interrupted, her tone even sharper. "It changes now." A softer, uncertain voice joined the call, her deputy counsel clearly patched in. "May I ask what prompted this decision, ma'am?" "No," Simone said, gaze fixed on the glittering skyline. "You don't need the details. What you need to know is this: I will not put my name beside theirs, and I will not attach my company's reputation to people who treat human dignity like it's optional." There was a rustle of papers on the other end, the muted thud of someone setting aside a file. "Understood," her lead counsel said finally, the warmth gone, replaced with brisk professionalism. "We'll initiate withdrawal procedures and prepare the press release. Make it clear," Simone added, "that this is permanent. No renegotiations. No revisiting terms in the future. When they call, and they will, the answer is no." "Yes, ma'am." The deputy counsel hesitated again. "The statement, do you want it vague, or—" "Ethical incompatibility," she repeated, her voice like the snap of a lock. "That's all the public explanation needed. The rest is for them to live with." "Yes, ma'am," they echoed in unison. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her clutch. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the night air, letting the decision settle over her. There was no rush of adrenaline, no pang of doubt, just certainty. A steady, quiet certainty that this was the only path forward. Behind her, through the glass doors, the gala went on untouched by reality. The Witmores moved through their guests like royalty, accepting compliments, posing for photographs, clinking glasses in anticipation of a future they didn't know had already dissolved. Margaret was laughing, her hand resting on Brandon's arm as he exaggerated a story to a table of young investors. Sophia floated past a group of older men, smiling in that precise way that suggested access to insider privilege. And Charles, the man whose empire was dangling by a thread, looked relaxed for the first time in months. Simone watched them from the shadows of the balcony. The irony wasn't lost on her. They believed they had humiliated her, reduced her to an outsider begging for entry. In truth, they had sealed their own fate. She turned back toward the city, letting the door click shut behind her. Inside, champagne glasses clinked. they still thought they'd won. By the time the first rays of morning touched the skyline, the damage was already in motion. The business wires were the first to break the news. Richardson Global Industries terminates Witmore Industries merger, cites ethical incompatibility. The words were everywhere within minutes. Financial news outlets pushed alerts to millions of devices. Social media feeds lit up, hashtags forming in real time. By 8 a.m., every major paper in New York had the story on its front page. Anchors on the morning shows spoke about it with the same mixture of shock and intrigue usually reserved for political scandals. One outlet ran a side-by-side photo. Charles Witmore smiling at last night's gala, and Simone in the same building hours earlier. The caption reading, "The woman who walked away." The markets opened at 9. By 9:30, Witmore Industries stock had fallen 20%. By noon, it was down 47. Trading screens lit up with red, a waterfall of sell orders flooding the system. Investors who had been promised stability after the merger saw nothing but freefall. Calls poured into Witmore headquarters, not from interested partners, but from angry shareholders demanding answers. Creditors, suddenly aware there would be no $10 billion infusion to save the company, began calling in loans. Lines of credit were frozen, terms were tightened. Even longtime associates started distancing themselves, unwilling to risk being pulled under in the undertow. Inside the Witmore offices, chaos reigned. Charles stormed from one conference room to another, tie loosened, face pale with the realization settling in. Every question he asked was met with the same answer. Richardson Global was gone. The statement was final. There would be no renegotiation, no second chance. "How the hell did this happen?" he barked at his legal counsel, voice cracking under the weight of it. "They didn't give details," the lawyer replied, shifting uncomfortably. "Only that the decision was made at the highest level." It wasn't until later in the morning, when one of his junior staff slid a phone across the table, that Charles finally saw the photograph. The image was grainy but clear enough. A woman in a wine-stained gown, standing in the marble foyer of his penthouse. Margaret was in the background, her mouth mid-sentence, Brandon and Sophia laughing nearby. Recognition hit like a punch to the gut. The name in the caption didn't need explanation. Simone Richardson. The woman they had mocked, excluded, and paraded as a spectacle was the same woman whose signature could have saved them. For a long moment, Charles said nothing. He just stared at the screen, replaying the events of the night before with a new, brutal clarity. The jokes, the disdain, the refusal of even a glass of water. Margaret entered the office mid-meeting, still in a silk robe, irritation etched into her face. "Do you know what the press is saying about me?" she demanded. "They're using words like bigoted and racist. I am not." He cut her off with a look that made her falter. "You had no idea who she was, did you?" Margaret hesitated, then shook her head. "Of course not. She didn't look." "Exactly," Charles said, his voice low and dangerous. "That's the problem." By the afternoon, the story had evolved. It was no longer just a corporate bombshell. It was a scandal about arrogance, exclusion, and prejudice in the highest social circles. Business analysts on cable news didn't bother softening the language. "This is what happens when old money refuses to adapt," one said bluntly. They didn't just lose a deal. They exposed exactly why they can't survive in the modern market. Photos from the gala spread online, capturing the smirks, the pointing, the mocking circle around Simone. Paired with the news of the merger's collapse, the images told a story too clear to ignore. Calls from allies stopped. Invitations to upcoming events were quietly rescinded. By evening, several charities publicly announced they were re-evaluating their association with the Witmore name. Charles sat alone in his office, the city lights blinking in the distance, his phone buzzing every few minutes with another piece of bad news. His empire wasn't just shrinking, it was disintegrating in real time. The family's name became a punchline overnight. Charles had never been the kind of man to wait on anyone. Yet now, he sat in the private lounge of a midtown hotel, checking his watch for the fourth time in as many minutes, waiting for the woman whose signature had slipped through his hands. He had called her office twice that morning. The first time, he got her assistant. The second time, her CFO. Both responses had been polite but final. Miss Richardson's calendar was full. It was only when he called from his personal cell and made it clear he wanted to speak face to face that she agreed to 20 minutes. When she walked in, she didn't hurry. She moved with the same steady confidence she had carried into boardrooms her entire career, the same confidence she had carried onto the Witmores' marble floor before they tried to strip it away. Charles stood as she approached, his smile strained. "Ms. Richardson, thank you for meeting me. I appreciate your time." She sat across from him, resting her hands lightly on the table. "You said you wanted to talk about the merger." He nodded, leaning forward. "Look, last night things were said that shouldn't have been said. I'm not going to defend it. My family." He paused, choosing his words. "Sometimes they get caught up in the moment. I'm sure you understand." Her gaze didn't waver. "No, I don't." Charles cleared his throat. "What I mean is, we shouldn't let one misunderstanding erase months of work. This deal, it's good for both of us, and I'm willing to make things right, publicly, if necessary." She let the silence stretch until he shifted in his seat. "This isn't about bad press, Mr. Witmore. It's about the truth that came out when your family thought I was beneath them. No statement can erase that." "I can control the narrative," he pressed. "We can make this look like nothing happened. Keep the focus on the numbers." "The numbers," she said evenly, "were never the problem. The problem is that you think dignity can be negotiated, that you can insult someone's humanity one night and shake hands the next morning if the balance sheet looks right." He leaned back, his jaw tightening. "Are you saying there's no chance? None at all?" "I'm saying respect is not negotiable," she replied. Her tone wasn't sharp, but it landed with the weight of a verdict. Charles tried again. "I can assure you." "You can assure me nothing," she interrupted, her voice low but unshakable. "You didn't stop them, you didn't question them, you stood there while they laughed. And the truth is, if you didn't know who I was last night, you'd still be standing there with them now." He swallowed hard, the truth cutting deeper than he expected. "You can rebuild your company," she continued. "Maybe not to what it was, but enough to survive. But you will do it without me. This conversation is over." Her words didn't carry anger, they carried finality. For a long moment, Charles just sat there, staring at the table between them, as if some overlooked detail might change the outcome. But there was nothing left to argue. Slowly, he pushed back his chair and rose to his feet. "Understood," he said quietly. His voice lacked the confidence it once held. "Thank you for your time." He left the lounge without looking back. His reflection in the glass doors a reminder that the man who had walked in expecting control was leaving with none. But Margaret couldn't let it go, and made their ruin even worse. If the Witmores had believed losing the merger was their only problem, the following weeks proved them wrong. The financial collapse was brutal, but the social collapse was worse, because it happened in rooms they couldn't buy their way back into. Margaret was the first to feel it. Her calendar, once crowded with luncheons, galas, and charity board meetings, began to thin. First, an art fundraiser she'd attended for 15 years sent a polite email saying they were streamlining the guest list. Then the annual Metropolitan Dinner, where her table had always been in the first row, informed her there were no available seats this year. The language was polite. The meaning was not. She made calls to friends she'd known for decades, women who had once sought her approval before hosting events of their own. The calls went unanswered. Text messages received nothing more than a brief, neutral, "Hope you're well." It was the social equivalent of a closed door. Sophia, who had built her personal brand on a carefully curated feed of charity events, rooftop parties, and vacations in Capri, noticed it next. Her circle, influencers, models, and heiresses who thrived on being photographed together, began pulling away. Photos she appeared in stopped being tagged. Group dinners went from 12 guests to 11. Invitations never reached her. One afternoon, she opened her phone to find that 3 of her closest friends had unfollowed her. Within days, the number doubled. On social media, absence is a message. In Sophia's world, it was the loudest kind. Brandon's exile came with less subtlety. At his favorite private club, where he had spent countless nights drinking and bragging with other legacies, his keycard suddenly failed. The concierge, avoiding eye contact, told him the membership committee had reconsidered his status. It was an open secret among members that the real reason had nothing to do with unpaid dues. It was about optics. Being seen laughing at a black woman during a charity event for inclusion had made them radioactive. In the upper tiers of New York society, reputation moved faster than fact. A headline paired with the wrong photograph could end decades of cultivated influence in a week. And the photographs had been everywhere. Simone standing in the foyer with wine on her gown. Margaret mid-laugh. Brandon with a champagne flute pointing in her direction. Sophia smiling over her shoulder as she whispered to a guest. They were images that told a complete story without words, and no one wanted to be connected to it. The invitations that did come were from people they barely knew, for events that didn't matter. Gone were the charity galas that determined who was in and who was out. Gone were the first-name greetings from reporters, the friendly nods from old allies. Margaret tried to save face, hosting her own gatherings in the penthouse, but even those failed. Fewer than half of the invitees showed up, and most didn't stay long. The ones who did came for the spectacle, to see the Witmores diminished, to witness a family who had once dictated the rules, now living under them. For a family that had spent their lives defining themselves by who they could exclude, the reversal was devastating. Every snub was a reminder. Power built on contempt for others has no foundation. They had mocked her in public, and their punishment would be public too. 2 months after the Witmores' fall from grace, the marble-floored hall where it all happened was being prepared for another major event. Crystal chandeliers were polished until they looked like suspended stars, and a stage was erected where the Witmores had once planned to announce their historic partnership. This time, there would be no Witmore branding, no society photographers pre-selecting who was worth a shot. The invitations had gone out quietly, not through the city's usual social channels, but directly to entrepreneurs, innovators, and artists, all from minority-owned businesses. Fashion designers from Harlem, tech founders from Atlanta, coffee roasters from the Bronx, jewelry makers from indigenous communities, and restaurateurs whose menus carried the flavors of their heritage. No one knew who had funded it. The official host was a respected diversity foundation, but behind the scenes, the six-figure sponsorship had come from Simone herself. She had given strict instructions. Her name was to appear nowhere on the materials. The focus was on the attendees, the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and underestimated. When the night arrived, the atmosphere was unrecognizable from the gala months earlier. The room buzzed with genuine conversation, people exchanging ideas and contacts without checking last names or bank balances first. Display tables showcased handcrafted goods, prototypes of innovative products, and marketing materials for startups. The bar served drinks named after civil rights leaders, and the menu featured dishes inspired by multiple cultures. A few journalists recognized the location. Their coverage couldn't ignore the irony. The same hall where a black woman had been mocked and excluded was now filled with celebration, opportunity, and representation. One article's headline read, "From gatekeeping to opening doors, the transformation of the Witmore Gala venue." Another was more direct. The room they tried to keep her out of now belongs to everyone. The Witmores, of course, were not invited. Even if they had been, the guest list was no longer theirs to control. Margaret reportedly called a former board member of the foundation to inquire about the event, but her calls were never returned. Sophia pretended not to care, posting photos from a weekend trip out of state. Brandon didn't say anything publicly, but a former club acquaintance claimed he'd complained privately that the whole city's gone woke. Inside the hall, Simone mingled quietly in the background, speaking with vendors and congratulating award recipients. She never mentioned her connection to the night's funding, letting the spotlight stay on those who had earned it. More than once, she thought of her grandmother and the advice she had carried her whole life. Respect is worth more than any check. Tonight was proof. As the evening drew to a close, the foundation's director took the stage to thank the anonymous donor who had made the showcase possible. The applause that followed was genuine, heartfelt, and in Simone's mind, it was enough. Outside, the Witmores' penthouse was dark. Their absence from the city's social scene had become the norm, their names now associated with arrogance and loss instead of influence. But Simone's real victory wasn't financial. The venue's lights had dimmed, the last of the guests were gone, and the sound of dismantled tables echoed faintly in the distance. Simone stood alone near the stage, looking out at the space that had once been the scene of her public humiliation. "They thought they could strip me of dignity," her voice said quietly into the stillness. "But dignity isn't theirs to give or take." She let the words settle in her mind. That night at the Witmore Gala could have ended differently. She could have swallowed the insults, signed the contract, and pretended none of it mattered. On paper, she might have walked away with an even larger empire. But in her heart, she would have been living with the knowledge that she'd allowed herself to be bought. Her grandmother's lessons echoed like they had every time the world tried to tell her she didn't belong. Don't let them decide your worth. Don't measure yourself by their approval. And never trade respect for money. The return is never worth the cost. Simone had carried those words from a cramped apartment in Newark to corner offices in glass towers around the world. They were her compass when boardrooms ignored her, when headlines doubted her, when she was the only black woman at the table. And they were her compass the night the Witmores revealed exactly who they were. She walked down from the stage and stood in the very spot where Margaret had sneered at her, where Brandon had raised his champagne glass like a joke, where Sophia had whispered her broom closet remark. She pictured the circle of faces, the tilted heads, the small smirks. Now, that space had been filled with applause for people who had been told, "You don't belong," too many times in their lives. They had been celebrated here, and that was worth more than any deal she could have made. Simone knew she hadn't just taken something away from the Witmores. She had taken the one thing they couldn't buy back, the illusion of superiority. Their name no longer commanded the city's deference. It inspired only quiet avoidance or outright ridicule. That was their true loss. And for her, the victory wasn't measured in their downfall. It was measured in the quiet pride of knowing she had refused to bend. It was in keeping her grandmother's promise alive, not just for herself, but for the people who had been watching, for the ones who needed to see that you can walk away and still win. Her gaze lifted to the grand chandelier above. Once, its glow had illuminated a night meant to cement the Witmores' power. Now it shone on a room where every guest had been welcome for their talent, their ideas, and their drive, not for the pedigree of their last name. She took a deep breath, her voice steady, her conviction clear. Have you ever seen arrogance collapse under its own weight? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, like and subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Simone turned toward the exit, leaving the hall behind. But the truth was, the hall would never leave her. Not because of what they tried to take, but because of what she'd proven they could never touch.